fruitful discussion afterwards. So I hand over to Melanie and to Kersti, and the floor is now yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're also really happy to be presenting today. I hope you can all hear and see me well. We have both been working in this area for quite a while. So please, I see my camera is not working. It's working now. Yeah, please, whenever, maybe there's, I don't know what is wrong with my camera right now. I'll just continue talking. It worked during the test. No idea what's wrong now. Yeah, it seems good. Okay. Yeah. If you have questions in between, if we are using languages or terms or abbreviations that you don't know, please post them in the chat, because sometimes it happens when you're so used to talking about things that you forget that other people might not be familiar with all the terms. Also, the topic is very broad. You will see this during our presentation, maybe also because some of you might have heard a lot in recent years about the intersection of technology, education, international development, and also inclusion. It's a very broad field. So we really hope we will have a lively discussion after the presentation. Yeah, please post all your questions. We can talk about more examples. We can certainly not cover everything in full depth in this short presentation, but to make sure that the stuff that is most important to you gets covered, feel free to ask questions. So, yeah, what is ICT for inclusive education? As I briefly said already, it's a very broad field. Maybe it's not really a field yet. It's more an intersection of different areas that come together that might be or might become an actual field of research more and more, luckily. The areas that play a very crucial role for inclusive ICT-supported inclusive education in international development are the areas ICT for development, or ICT for D, that has become more prominent since the 90s. ICT for education is an area that has been discussed very much in recent years. Also inclusive education, but the intersection of ICTs and inclusive education, as we will also see in the presentation, is rather thin at the research base for this specific area. So what are our main findings in this broad field? We started with looking at ICT for development, as this more or less gives the foundation for how to make ICTs work in a context that might also technically be more challenging and difficult, but also in terms of certain social or cultural or broader context issues. So the lessons learned in the field of ICT for development, ICTs have been recognized as being useful in international development already since the international development became a field in itself, which was in the early 1950s. At that time, it was called or included in an area called development communication, or later participatory development communication, and ICTs was mainly using radio or television for educational, or at that time mostly economic development reasons. Lessons learned, as I said, ICTs are not standalone solutions or catalysts, but tools with the potential to support a wider change or purpose. So what this means is to just supply tools or technology or infrastructure does not lead to change in itself. And in the early and very also euphoric times of ICT for development, the notion of we have to supply infrastructure and tools and devices, and then people will become developed, yeah, did not work as it was planned. A rather prominent example from these times are the telecenters that some of you might have heard. This often meant installing a center in rather remote areas with little infrastructure, connecting them to electricity, connecting them to internet later if available, and hoping these telecenters that would provide access to information, access to educational sources, that this would be enough to encourage people to learn something, that this would in itself be enough for people to learn about job opportunities, to qualify themselves with distance learning. But it soon turned out that for a number of reasons this did not work the way it was planned. So prominently, these centers were in most areas mainly used by either already privileged groups of the society. They were rarely used for, not as much as planned, for educational or economic purposes. They were used for playing, for gaming, for watching films, actually for stuff that is probably also most popular in other countries. So it was not surprising from a research point of view that these centers did not function by themselves as educational boosts. Also, technical problems soon came up. Who should pay electricity? Who maintains the devices? Who pays for internet connection? These were all unsolved solutions. Now there is an increasing debate about the need for context relevance and needs-based approaches that never depart from a technology as a starting point. So we should not look at what technology do we want to use and then think about how can it be installed, but the approach is much stronger now towards finding out what are actually the local needs and what is context relevant in this area we want to work. Also, the recognition of diversity is much stronger, or is one of the lessons learned, and the need for participatory approaches and an involvement of all stakeholders throughout the project cycle. So in the planning, policymakers need to be involved as much as if the target group is a school, the students, the teachers, the parents, obviously all to a certain extent, but it is a very important lesson learned from ICT for development, that the local partners need to be involved at all levels. Also, as I mentioned before, the question of maintenance and sustainability for technical solutions. So, spotlight inclusive ICTs. There's a need for active and effective involvement of learners with disabilities, their families, representatives or advocates in the development, implementation, monitoring and evaluation of policies and services aimed at facilitating learners' access to inclusive education opportunities. This is UNESCO's model policy for inclusive ICTs. Another definition of this area comes from the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs, and they say an ICT project can be called accessible or is accessible to persons with disabilities if they can either use it as it is, with minor adjustments or configuration, or in conjunction with some assistive technology. So that's just a definition, what is seen as inclusive ICT. What is the concern regarding inclusive ICTs? There is still a lack of policy model, a lack of research, as I mentioned before, and also a lack of the policy discourse that looks at the problem of potential exclusion from ICT due to wider environment and cultural and socio-political context. So the focus in research and also in practice is still often on the technology itself. So there's much concern about how can the technology be modified, adapted, or what kind of technology should be used. The wider accessibility is taken into account. The focus is often limited to infrastructure and economic aspects. So there are exceptions, like the Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs, which does recognize the core relevance of participation in empowering people for using ICTs, and also the emphasis relevance of allowing the user to design or appropriate the product to adapt it to their own needs. One benefiting or promising area in that field is the free and open source community, which is rapidly growing, and it can bring significant benefits as it allows adaptation and change of certain technologies. So the technology is not necessarily developed isolated outside the partners and the participating group, but it is able to adapt the technology to some extent. So ICTs for education, as briefly mentioned at the beginning. Even in this area, there is still rather little in-depth research on the impact of investments in educational technologies in middle and low-income countries. There is a growing number of research going on at the moment, but so far the results are still rather mixed. So the studies that exist on ICT for education has similar conclusions as the field of ICT for development that was mentioned at the beginning. So the data to support perceived benefits from ICT is still rather limited. And the evidence of effective impact is also rather debatable. I want to mention also that this does not necessarily mean that there are no promising projects. This only means that there has not been enough research probably. The research has not been coordinated well between different countries, so there might be promising results also in the informal sector, where a lot is happening. There are a lot of pilots that also seem to be promising, but based on the research, there is still rather little strong data to support positive impacts. Said that, I will continue here with the rather critical review. There's a need for internationally accepted standards, methodologies, and indicators to better measure the real benefits of ICT in education. Again, this shows that these standards are not available yet. So there might be projects and aspects of ICT for education that have not been grasped yet by research. Recognition of challenges and measuring clear benefits of ICT use in education is necessary. ICT in education is not nearly as pervasive as in daily life. For example, smartphones and the use of tablets and laptops is not in the same way, is not as strong in schools and formal education as it is in daily life. This is not only the case for developing countries, of course, this is generally the case. The impact of ICTs in formal education remains limited so far based on the results. And there is no correlation between massive infrastructure investment and improvement of educational system. again, this can also mean that the approach of using ICTs for education needs to be adapted, improved, reworked. This does not necessarily only mean that ICTs cannot have a positive impact on education. So more attention must be paid to the processes and wider enabling environments, the quality indicators to measure digital literacy and skills needed in information society. As I said, there are very different indicators used in different countries, so it's also difficult, or in different research projects, it's difficult to compare. And contextuality and ending of top-down import of most products, services, and expertise and research from high-income contexts. So also in terms of research, it is important that there's a stronger participatory approach of cooperating with researchers in the countries that the projects are based in. So what is this information, among others, based on? There's one analysis by the World Bank of national ICT and education policies over time in over 100 countries. Again, it revealed similarities in terms of key criticism in the general field of ICT4D. ICT alone is not a driver for change. We had the same thing in the beginning. Access alone is not enough. Having a laptop does not mean that the education is improved through the device. One very prominent example here is the One Laptop Per Child project that was very much access and tool driven. A lot of effort was put into adapting a technological device to the conditions in developing countries. It is almost unbreakable, or was advertised as almost unbreakable. It needs very little power. It has educational games. Mostly the whole operating system was educational content, and still it was in many countries difficult to achieve educational or to achieve the educational goals that were pursued with the project. So one reason can be that the needs, the local needs, and the context has different demands, or the local needs are different from what this laptop could offer. For many educational systems, they find it difficult to address the realities of the information society, was also one result revealed in this study. And there's insufficient attention paid to the underlying purpose of ICT use. What is the core need to be addressed through the use of ICT? So often it is just thought ICTs in itself might bring some improvement, or they are just used in different topics, but there is no real knowledge or strategy why ICTs are being used in that regard. Inclusive education. The most relevant contemporary approach for ICT and inclusive education is probably the universal design in education. It moves beyond the limited notion of accessibility to embrace a concept of inclusion that addresses the individual needs of all people. More information, of course, you can also find in the webinar and the policy brief on accessibility. It moves beyond the limitations of a mere focus on, for instance, assistive technologies that are usually tailored to the needs of one specific target group, whilst the universal design is working towards accessibility for all. And it is in line with the recognition of needs-based and context-relevant approaches that were also mentioned before in the field of ICT4D, or also ICT for education. I now hand over to my colleague Kersti. Kersti, your microphone is still off.
Do you hear me now? Do you hear me? Okay. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having us. Yeah, so I will go into the part of advice. What lessons do we draw from those findings that we gathered? What we came up with is a design of a two-level framework approach towards ICT for inclusive education, which is still a very young field. And we have been looking at two levels. One is the more overarching policy level, and one is the more concrete, like practical level. This is what you see here in this scheme, and I will guide you through it. Okay, so on policy level, actually look at the other. On policy level, we are following an overall policy guidance, which is based on the 2030 agenda, and which states to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So what is important to really be clear on is that point of departure is looking into equitable quality education and not depart from the tech level, as Melanie already elaborated on. So that means understanding education in the broadest possible way, also to ensure like an inclusive approach, focusing therefore on processes and the strengthening of capacities of education systems. So the widest, broadest framework you would look at, reaching all learners as much as educators. So that means considering education as a basic human right and the foundation for a more just and equal society. So that is a more broad perspective from which we dive into the field and how to then practically handle it. Overall policy guidance on technology for inclusive education means on a policy level to depart from a structural level or approach. So that means focusing or aiming to provide equitable access to education for all groups, taking into account their individual context and consequent needs. So the relevance of needs and context, as has already been mentioned, and that goes versus the often used approach of targeting a specific marginalized group, having a very kind of narrow approach to how to dive into the topic. Why we separate into this policy and practical level distinction, or this two-level approach, is within the broader field of ICT for development. I think we have two main shortcomings, recognized shortcomings. One is that existing policy frameworks usually do not support the practical work field. That means where there has been recognition of what is needed and how we should proceed in the practical world is often limited by policy frameworks which just merely do not enable such an enactment. And so bringing them together and being conscious about what is needed on what level is very important. And another issue is that fields are not sufficiently learning from each other, and I will come to that in a bit. So we pull in existing frameworks in order to build up on recognitions that are already there. And that means when focusing on the concrete educational process, we take as the main framework the universal design for learning approach. So looking at solutions that benefit all students with all their potential diversity. And yeah, as mentioned, that can be also found in the accessibility webinar and policy brief. And we also have linked all documentation needed for that in the policy brief, which will be made available to you. And another framework is the inclusive integration of ICTs at policy level. So that is a policy framework which specifically focuses on how to integrate ICTs, or what to take into consideration on policy design level when it is about the integration of inclusive ICT approaches in policy work. I will not elaborate on that. We have linked that also all, and it is documented in the policy brief, and you see here. But I think I will now dive more in the practical part. So that is the second level, what we call the actionable framework for ICT integration. And what we have there is the principles for digital development. That is a framework of 11 principles which have been designed over years of multi-stakeholder process and cross-testing, of which are the core principles that derive out of years, like now over a decade of lessons learned from the field of ICT for development in general. And throughout different thematic areas in the field of ICT for development. So it's a kind of living guideline, or are kind of living guidelines to help develop practitioners integrate established best practices into technology-enabled programs. And that relates to what I mentioned before, that we do see still very strongly that lessons that have been learned are usually not taken up. So there's a limit, or too limited cross-sectoral collaboration, learning from each other, and there's still a lot of reinventing the wheel and making old mistakes again happening in the field of ICT4D, which we strongly believe that a very young field like ICT for inclusive education can prevent if the field looks at those frameworks that take all these lessons learned into consideration. So that's why the principles for digital development. Its roots it finds in individuals, development organizations, and also donor organizations who came together in that process and started calling for a more concerted effort to institutionalize the many hard lessons learned, as I just mentioned. So it's a wide consortium, including very different stakeholders, which brings in very different perspectives and needs as well. We have linked the website. Let me see if I can open it for you. Oh, no. No, if you can see the website. Maybe not. Otherwise, on this next slide, we have a screenshot. Which shows the landing page of the website of the Principles for Digital Development. And when it comes to the use of ICTs for inclusive education, there are specifically 3 principles of great relevance, which is number 1, 4, and 7. 1 meaning designing with the user, which basically means context-appropriate solutions informed by user needs. Which means including all user groups in the planning, development, implementation, and assessment of programs, but also policy framework design. So that means, for instance, not only ICT developers or app developers, if a program thinks it does need a technical solution, but educators, students, all target groups that somehow are affected or are affecting an educational process. So that is to enable solutions which are sensitive to and useful for the most marginalized populations. And then it's principle 4, build for sustainability, which means utilizing and investing in local communities and developers, helping to catalyze their growth, engage with local governments to ensure integration into national strategy, and identify high-level government advocates. What we've seen a lot is that specifically in a development context, it's often developers and IT specialists or experts or IT firms from the corporate sector that are like helicoptered in order to design solutions or even design them from the distance, which is not really sustainable. Whereas in countries, in really most countries, we do by now have experts which are very much involved in that field and which are able to anticipate local solutions and local relevancies and develop them. And there's a huge community across the sector which is building solutions which are reusable, possible to appropriate, to adjust to different contexts and needs and so on. And investing in those open and constantly like ongoing processes is much more sustainable and beneficial to everyone in the end, rather than keeping working in closed systems, working with experts who are not, who are maybe the medical experts, but not context-specific experts and so on. And another aspect is relating to engaging with local governments, where we do invest in educational programs that should be structural, and that should then mean ensuring to collaborate, to have the buy-in of the local policy level where that's possible. And principle 7, reuse and improve. That relates to what I already mentioned: use, modify, and extend existing tools, platforms, and frameworks when possible. Develop in modular ways, favoring approaches that are interoperable over those that are monolithic by design. And Melanie already mentioned the free and open source community. There is increasing applications and tools which are designed in a way that are openly available, freely available, to work on, to adjust to different contexts, to add functionality to where needed, and then to not only use for your own programs, but also to give back to that continuous ICT learning community, in order to be part of the community which is dedicated to make those tools, those ICTs, technological solutions, more efficient, better, and more sustainable. And also here, to these two main levels, like the policy and the actionable level, we do see as supportive frameworks the Universal Design for ICT framework. So this is a specification to the Universal Education framework, and it is really meant to only come in like at the very last moment. So once you when you look into the policy brief, you see in all detail the Universal Design for ICT approach really focuses on how to develop ICTs that are usable and accessible to the widest range of people. Promotes a user-centered design approach, so that really feeds in the digital principle approach of designing with the user, and not only in the very end, but throughout a whole process cycle. So from identifying the real need, not the technology we think is relevant, but what is the real need of people in terms of improving educational situations, increasing the level of inclusivity within the educational system. So only in the very stage where actually needs are defined, contexts are defined, strategies are defined, and an idea or an overview of what communication channels could be relevant in order to support those overall concepts, then we come to the stage where we look at, okay, which technologies do make sense here, and that then as a first step relates to which technologies make sense in a very specific context, so which communication channels are already available, are trusted, are affordable, are sustainable in terms of, for instance, what power use they have, what is the level of maintenance, what is the expertise, the capacity needed in order to actually use them, and so on. So there are all these questions flowing in, which Melanie has mentioned. And then once that is all considered and decisions are made based on that, then we look into what specific, for instance, artificial intelligence solution and so on could play a role, could make sense, could be maintainable, and where do eventually new developments have to take place, where do we need to adjust certain tools or build something new if there's really nothing yet available. So, and then at a even more concrete stage, we have collected a set of concrete actions deriving from the main findings of the research and the framework that we have mapped out. And I will briefly guide you through those. The first is really like, what is the point of departure? So when you design a project, or when you are developing a policy framework, always keep those aspects in mind in order to make sure that also that framework is actually enabling such concrete actions on more practical level. So point of departure should always be inclusive education, as we have mentioned. The point of departure, should be that, and the contextual challenges involved in achieving it. The question of how and where ICTs can play a supportive role should be the final step. So starting with the context, ending with the tech. Tech always comes very last in the process of designing a strategy or having a policy framework. The second is context and demand as guiding principles, and we have mentioned that. So those should be your main guiding points when identifying the best tactics and tools to be used in wherever your program is supposed to be executed. So that means closely analyzing the learning environment in the local context. How do people learn? Where do people learn? Which means to learn do they have? And so on. Starting with a problem identified by or co-identified with target groups, like all different target groups that do play a role, so learners, teachers, and so on, rather than just focusing on a technical solution. And understand the full range of challenges, not only in the classroom, but also within society as a whole, and the specific local context. So it's not only looking within the classroom, but what could support or prevent students, for instance, from learning, from using specific technology outside of the classroom. Then at micro level, the first step should be to analyze the situation and identify the target groups for inclusion. So that even before being able to engage all those target groups, it's very important to really look into what stakeholders all do play a direct or indirect role in that process, and therefore could be supportive or hindering a process as well. Thinking of restricted government levels, depending on what educational program, for instance, you are working on. Could there be some restrictions culturally, politically, and so on. Then another concrete action point would be to focus on process-based approaches. So not solution-based, but really focusing on the full cycle of a process or project design, rather than only outcomes, and incorporating wide enabling environments in terms of actors, networks, context. All those aspects will be crucial for sustainable research, but also policy and project design. So that means focusing on objectives. What is the challenge you are dealing with? What is the challenge you aim to overcome or to tackle, rather than what is the technology I want to use or so. And think strategically, so addressing all stakeholders with appropriate strategies, tactics, and means of communication. So different stakeholders within such process have different needs and need different tactics within a broader program. So teachers do need a different approach than the students, and maybe the director of a school, or the governing board, or whatever it is that is relevant in your specific context. And another point is the concept of innovation, or the definition of innovation. There's a huge focus on the term innovation lately, and usually it is associated with the latest technology or the latest hype of technology. But what innovation really is in an ICT for development context is what is relevant to the user and what really features into the very local context you're working on. So that is potentially not anything digital or not anything online, but as long as it is what people actually can use and will use, especially on a longer term, then that is innovative. This is something very crucial to consider, I believe. Further point, starting point, locally accessible and in-use relevant technology. We've already mentioned that so briefly. First, look at what is already there. So also within schools, for instance, what do schools already work with, and maybe already have experience with what works or what doesn't work, rather than like helicoptering in like the latest tech, which then potentially cannot be used due to electricity issues or capacity issues, and so on, which Melanie also has mentioned, for instance, with the lessons learned from the One Laptop Per Child program. Include the enabling environment that relates to former action points. So social inclusion of marginalized learners and ICT functionality both depend on political will and societal readiness. So where you're designing a very innovative in the not the sense we mean it, but the other sense kind of way. If you design a project which will not be carried by the local communities you actually aim to work with, then this will not lead to success. So where the teachers are not supporting a process, or the students, or maybe the parents of the students, then a project will not be successful. Then no technology can ever compensate that. And the last point, I believe, think sustainable. So how can a project be maintained on a long term, and also how can technologies be useful beyond your own specific project? So that relates then to use open source and freely available solutions, invest and help to improve what is already available rather than building closed solutions from scratch, which means a lot of investment over and over again going into tech solutions which are already out there. This is money that can really be used in other ways. Provide teacher training, technical training, and technical maintenance, or consider how that is feasible, and therefore then how that determines which solutions you should choose or not. Involve the policy level, very important, specifically for educational projects or processes which are rather controversial in the context you work in. Yeah, teachers should receive regular training and support for both ICT and inclusive education to enable them to develop the curriculum to respond to specific needs of their students over time and after the initial training or so has passed. So these are our concrete action points, and I think with this we come to the end of our presentation and are happy to receive questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kersti and Melanie. It was very interesting, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions or comments. You can also share your experience if you want to, so please feel free. Just raise your hand or write your question in the text box. Do we have already questions? Ah, yeah, we have one question. Sarah Herold. You just have to press on your microphone, then you can speak to us. Hello, Sarah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Sarah Herold. I'm currently an intern at the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, and I wanted to ask, do you have any concrete examples of either some technology that is in use in a developed country that has been implemented successfully or adapted successfully for use in another context, or just any kind of, as you said, innovative approach that was appropriate in the context that then actually worked to improve education in some way? So just interested in if there are concrete, like, promising practice examples already, or if there is still a lack of those.
Melanie, you're talking, no? Or?
Oh, did it not
Melanie,
work?
we can't hear you.
Okay, I'll write it in the chat box.
Can you hear me now?
Now we could hear you very well.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I was just saying there are indeed rather few examples, at least from the research or the well-documented perspective. There might be some more experimental ones. There is a website that has an interesting collection of approaches that is called the Zero Project. That is also mentioned in the policy brief, where you can look up some examples, mostly from developed countries, but also promising examples that are can potentially be implemented in developing countries as well. But I mean, we have mentioned the importance of context a lot here, because most examples that you can find are very specific. So they really, the ones that are successful, they really look at the local situation. They look what are the needs, what kinds of technologies make sense in this context, how much funding do we have for how long, and that usually defines what is done. We have mentioned also a couple of such projects in the brief. A lot is with assistive technology, so with specifically physically disabled, or not physically, but for disabled or persons with disability. For this group, there is some more examples. We've tried to approach the inclusion term rather broadly to cover a very wide range of that can lead to exclusion. So yeah, for assistive technologies, there is a number of examples. We've also mentioned open educational resources and open source. In that area, there are also some interesting examples. For example, translating or transferring educational textbooks into accessible formats. Kersti, do you have some other examples? What else comes to my mind?
Yeah, very concretely bringing together all these three pillars. Yeah, there are indeed a few, and a good collection from the Zero Project report. But they are all very tool-based. So it's, yeah, for instance, what Melanie just mentioned, translating information into multiple accessible formats. But then there are always questions in terms of maintainability, sustainability, how to sustainably integrate that into wider projects. Other than that, in the development field, there are some interesting examples from the entertainment education field, I'd say. And how cross-media approaches are used in order to teach life skills and so on to marginalized youth. And there you will see that you always, those processes are never based on one technology or one communication channel, but are always a collection of different means of teaching, different means of providing information, different means of engaging people, and engaging all different groups at the same time. So students, teachers, in most cases also parents, and also how to involve the government or governance level.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Do we have another question? I don't think we have one in the moment, but I have a question. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the potential of ICT for inclusive education. Like, if you don't look at the context, just to know, do you see a potential of using ICT for inclusive education, especially for marginalized groups like children with disabilities or with different languages? And what are the potentials?
Should I start, or you want to start?
Yes, please.
It depends a bit on how you pose the question. So potential for the technology alone as standalone, I would be rather critical. Potential to use certain means to increase inclusive education, yeah, for sure. But I think this can only be ever successful if we really depart from questioning, okay, what is inclusive education? What is inclusivity? What does that mean? To really engage everyone, to have a level of integrity, and what other work around providing the technology that can enable that connecting certain groups within civil society to learning processes, what also needs to happen in schools, for instance, in terms of stigmatization, in terms of enabling sensitizing teachers for how to involve different groups of students and so on. And that is something that requires more than technology, obviously.
Yeah, I would add there are, of course, exceptions where you can say, okay, this here it is just important to provide rather quick access for, let's say, people with disabilities, but also other groups like refugees, where some of the principles that we have mentioned before might be less relevant because you need a quick solution, but then it might not be possible to develop a long-term solution. If you think about long-term solutions, I would also say it is very important to look at the broader context. If a school in an area is surrounded by other schools that have no electricity or have no digital technologies in their curriculum, and it is only this one school that is supplied with digital technologies in order to provide access for a specific group in this school, one has to be aware that this might be an island solution. As I said, this might be acceptable in certain conditions, but it is also important to acknowledge that fact that often the environment or the context is not at the level to be able to provide technologies for education for all, really. So, and then it is a question where one wants to depart in providing equal access for all.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question, I think. Simone? We can see one hand.
There is a question in the chat.
In the chat. I can see it now. Do you see any approaches in Germany or any European country that could be translated into other local contexts?
Yeah, as we briefly mentioned, the Zero project report is definitely worth having a look at. There's a lot of examples that might at least partially be suitable if they are adapted to a local context to be transferred to a different country. As we said before, it is usually difficult to just use one approach and say it works the same way somewhere else. There's so many aspects that need to be taken into account to make sure something works. As we said, are the teachers willing to use the technology? Is the infrastructure there? How about, is it for all students or is it only for a few students? How do you deal with the situation if you only provide technology for a small group? So there's lots of different aspects that need to be considered. If these are taken into account, there might be also solutions that can be transferred. There are certainly very interesting approaches from developed countries, but some of them rather costly.
Yeah, and maybe adding to that, when looking at those project examples that we linked to also in the report, it's always interesting or good to look at the lessons learned or actually the take-up of a project or a technology in order to then get a wider idea in how successful has it really been. And I'm saying that because especially in the field of ICT for education or inclusive education in the developing context, you will see that there a lot of projects actually remained on pilot level, and that has a lot to do with that there has been a very narrow focus only on the tech rather than the enabling framework, or also of course a lot, and that is important to take into consideration in a planning process in the development context, because of restricted time, project timelines or funding timelines. So when such processes are implemented based on a specific grant or, you know, time and financially bound framework, then it's even more important to plan and to make decisions extremely wisely to ensure that also after that such a process will keep running and is owned by the communities or the schools or whatever you work with.
Okay, thank you. I think unfortunately we are running out of time, but the GIZ team will stay here another half an hour in the chat, so you still can ask your questions or give your comments. You can also contact us via email to inclusive-education@giz.de or write directly to Kersti or Melanie. We will send you again their email addresses in the chat box. The Science to Policy brief on ICT will be published in about 2 weeks. We will send it to you as soon as it will be finished with all relevant information. So please be sure that you have entered your email address correctly in the beginning or just write us an email. We will close the session, like always, with our film on Inclusive Education and Development Cooperation. We hope you will enjoy it. Please remember we will be here for another 30 minutes. And thank you very much for joining this webinar. Thank you again, Melanie and Kersti. And special thanks again to Ariane Lavaret for your support for your sign language interpretation. It was very great. So I hope you enjoy the movie now. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.